The only difference between a legend and a lunatic is success, and the most successful people you know are in some measure delusional, not insane, not disconnected from reality, but operating under a carefully constructed illusion about themselves, one that defies objective evidence, dismisses reasonable doubt, and persists despite contradiction. And here's what no one tells you. This delusion isn't a flaw in their psychology, it's the foundation of their power, because in a world where perception shapes reality, the person who believes something impossible about themselves has already taken the first step toward making it true. While others calculate probabilities and surrender to statistics, the delusional believer simply proceeds. Today we're examining why irrational self-belief works, not in spite of its irrationality, but because of it. Let's define our terms carefully. When I say delusional self-belief, I'm not talking about narcissistic personality disorder or clinical detachment from reality. I'm talking about something subtler and far more common. The capacity to hold an unshakable conviction about your potential that exceeds what the evidence currently supports. It's the entrepreneur who believes they'll build an empire when they're operating out of a garage. The artist who believes their work matters when no one's paying attention yet. The athlete who visualizes victory when every metric says they'll lose. The strategist who sees a path where others see only obstacles. By conventional standards, this is irrational. These people are ignoring data. They're inflating their importance. They're refusing to accept their limitations. And yet, they're the ones who change industries, create movements, accomplish what everyone said couldn't be done. Why? Because belief, even delusional belief, has psychological and strategic properties that rationality alone cannot replicate. It creates a different operating system. One that's immune to the doubt that paralyzes most people. One that bends probability through sheer persistence. The question we're exploring isn't whether delusional self-belief is rational. It's not. The question is, why does it work? To understand this, we need to examine how belief shapes behavior at the neurological and psychological level. Your brain doesn't distinguish cleanly between reality and conviction. When you believe something deeply enough, your nervous system organizes itself around that belief. Your perception filters information to confirm it. Your behavior aligns to fulfill it. Your energy mobilizes toward it. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy in action, but operating at a level far deeper than most people realize. Consider this. Every action you take is preceded by an internal assessment of probability. Can I do this? Will this work? Am I capable? These assessments happen in milliseconds, mostly unconsciously. And they determine whether you even attempt something, how much energy you invest, how long you persist when you encounter resistance. Now here's the mechanism. If your internal assessment says probably not, your behavior reflects that doubt. You hesitate, you hold back, you quit early, you radiate uncertainty, and others sense it, respond to it, mirror it back to you. The prophecy fulfills itself. But if your internal assessment is absolutely yes, even if that assessment is delusional, even if it contradicts external evidence, your behavior reflects that instead. You move with conviction, you take bold action, you persist past the point where reasonable people quit. And crucially, you radiate certainty, which makes others believe in you, invest in you, follow you. The delusion creates the reality it imagined. This is why people with delusional self-belief often outperform people with superior talent but inferior confidence. Talent determines your ceiling. Belief determines whether you ever approach it. Look at any major achievement in history, entrepreneurial, artistic, political, scientific, and you'll find someone who believed something impossible before anyone else did. They weren't responding to evidence. They were creating it. Steve Jobs believed Apple would change the world when it was two guys in a garage. Elon Musk believed he'd colonize Mars when he couldn't even afford to build a rocket. Muhammad Ali declared himself the greatest before he'd won a title. Were they being rational? No. Were they being strategic? Absolutely. Because belief is a force multiplier. It amplifies effort, sustains momentum, and shapes how others perceive you. And perception, as we've discussed before, is power. Now let's examine the opposite. What happens when you're too rational, too realistic, too aware of limitations? Realism sounds virtuous, It's supposedly honest, grounded, mature. But in practice, excessive realism often functions as sophisticated self-sabotage. Because here's what realism does. It calculates odds, identifies obstacles, catalogues reasons why something won't work. And while this can be useful for risk assessment, it's catastrophic for motivation. The more you focus on why something's unlikely, the less psychological energy you have to attempt it. This is the paralysis of analysis, the person who's too smart, too informed, too aware of complexity, and therefore never moves. They can tell you 17 reasons why every option is suboptimal, but they can't tell you what they've actually built, because calculation replaced action. There's a reason why many revolutionary innovations come from outsiders, people who don't know enough to understand why something's impossible. Their ignorance isn't a weakness, it's protective armor against the doubt that stops experts from trying. Consider the difference in internal narrative. The realist thinks, the data suggests this has a 10% chance of success. That's not good odds. I should probably focus my energy elsewhere. The delusional believer thinks, this is going to work. I don't care what the data says, I'll make it work. Who do you think puts in more effort? Who persists longer? Who radiates more conviction when pitching to investors, recruiting team members, or negotiating partnerships? Realism optimizes for avoiding failure. Delusional belief optimizes for attempting greatness. They're fundamentally different strategies for fundamentally different goals. Now, I'm not suggesting you should ignore reality entirely. Recklessness that disregards genuine constraints is just stupidity. But there's a massive difference between acknowledging reality and being limited by it. The master strategist sees obstacles clearly and believes in their capacity to overcome them anyway. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The delusional believer has constructed such a powerful why, such an unshakable conviction in their destiny or purpose, that the how becomes irrelevant. They'll find a way because failure isn't psychologically available as an option. This isn't rationality, but it's effective. Now let's look at this through the lens of power and strategic influence. Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. Perception management is power management. It's not enough to be capable. You must be perceived as capable. And the fastest way to control others' perception of you is to radiate absolute certainty in yourself. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes, "Men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived." But the deepest deception isn't lying to others. It's believing your own narrative so completely that it stops being a deception and becomes your operating reality. This is what separates the con artist from the visionary. The con artist knows they're lying. The visionary has transcended that distinction entirely. When you believe something impossible about yourself, you don't just convince yourself, you convince everyone around you. Conviction is contagious. Certainty is magnetic. People want to believe in someone who believes in themselves absolutely because it offers them the escape from their own doubt. This is why charismatic leaders, successful founders, influential artists, they all share this quality of unshakable self-belief that borders on delusion. They're not performing confidence, they've internalized it so deeply that performance and reality have merged. And here's the strategic advantage. When you genuinely believe you cannot fail, you negotiate differently. You take risks others won't. You persist past the point where reasonable people quit. You ask for things others wouldn't dare request, and often you get them simply because your conviction made others believe too. Machiavelli also wrote, "The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present." What he's describing is adaptability unconstrained by self-doubt. The person with delusional self-belief can pivot, can change course, can contradict themselves, and still maintain their aura of authority, because their underlying certainty never wavers. This is why traditional realists often lose to delusional optimists in competitions for power. The realist's doubt creates hesitation, hesitation creates weakness, weakness invites attack. But the delusional believer moves with such conviction that even their mistakes look like strategies. their failures like setbacks on an inevitable path to victory. Is this manipulative, perhaps? But it's also honest, because the delusional believer isn't trying to manipulate others. They're simply operating from a reality where their success is inevitable, and that reality is so convincing that others adopt it. So how do you actually construct this kind of unshakable self-belief? Because here's what most people misunderstand. Delusional self-belief isn't natural for most humans. It's built, constructed, maintained through specific psychological practices. First, selective attention and memory. The delusional believer becomes a curator of evidence that supports their narrative. Every small win is remembered, amplified, treated as confirmation. Every setback is reframed as temporary, situational, a necessary challenge on the path to inevitable success. This isn't lying, it's strategic interpretation. The same event can be framed as "I failed" or "I learned what doesn't work." The facts don't change, the meaning does. And meaning determines whether you persist or quit. Second, identity construction. The delusional believer doesn't just have a goal, they've merged their identity with that goal. They're not someone trying to build a company. They're a founder. They're not attempting to become an artist. They are an artist. The distinction is everything. When your identity depends on an outcome, your brain will mobilize far more resources to achieve it. Failure stops being an option because it would require destroying your sense of self. This is psychologically dangerous if taken too far, but strategically powerful when managed consciously. Third, environmental design. Surround yourself only with people who reinforce your delusion. Cut out the voices of reason that inject doubt, not because you can't handle criticism, but because, in the early stages of building something impossible, doubt is toxic. You need an echo chamber of belief until your foundation is solid enough to withstand skepticism. Steve Jobs was infamous for his reality distortion field, his ability to make people believe impossible timelines and impossible achievements were not only possible, but inevitable. How did he do it? By never ever acknowledging that something couldn't be done. He literally didn't allow that reality to exist in his presence. And eventually, his team stopped seeing it too. Fourth, constant action. Delusional self-belief collapses without behavioral confirmation. You can't just think your way to conviction. You must act as if it's already true. Each action reinforces the belief. Each reinforced belief fuels more action. It's a feedback loop. This is why fake it till you make it actually works, despite sounding like a cliché. You're not faking, you're becoming. Every time you act from a place of certainty, even manufactured certainty, you're training your nervous system to recognize that state as normal. The delusion becomes reality through repetition. This principle has ancient roots. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, wrote, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a mechanism. Your internal narrative shapes your external reality, not because the universe is magic, but because your thoughts determine your actions and your actions shape outcomes. The Stoics practiced what they called premeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils, but they also practiced its opposite, the cultivation of unshakable conviction in their own character. They believed they could handle whatever fate brought them. Not because they knew the future, but because they'd convinced themselves so thoroughly that their resolve wouldn't break. Nietzsche took this further. He spoke of will to power, not power over others, but the internal drive to overcome yourself, to become who you're capable of becoming. And he understood that this required a certain selective blindness. You must ignore the voices, internal and external, that say you can't, that catalogue your limitations, that remind you of your past failures. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." The chaos he's referring to is the willingness to break from conventional wisdom, to trust a vision others can't see, to act on belief that can't be justified by current evidence. This is the philosophical justification for delusional self-belief. Creation requires chaos. Innovation requires irrationality. Transformation requires believing something true before it's demonstrably true. The ancient mystery traditions understood this too. Initiation rites were designed to shatter the initiate's previous identity and install a new one. The process was traumatic, disorienting, and necessary. Because transformation requires destroying the old self completely, including its limiting beliefs, its realistic assessments, its knowledge of what's possible, you can't think your way into a new identity. You must construct it through ritual, through repeated affirmation, through acting as if it's already true, until the gap between performance and reality disappears. Modern psychology calls this cognitive behavioral therapy. Ancient wisdom called it initiation. Effective strategists call it necessary. Let's bring this into contemporary application. In today's world, delusional self-belief is more powerful than ever because we live in an attention economy where perception is reality and reality is negotiable. Look at social media influencers. Many of them started by acting as if they were already influential, posting with the confidence of someone with millions of followers when they had hundreds. The act of behaving like an authority eventually made them one. Their audience grew because their conviction made them compelling to watch. Look at startup founders. The ones who succeed aren't always the ones with the best ideas or the most funding. They're the ones who believed so completely in their vision that they convinced investors to believe, employees to join, customers to take a chance on an unproven product. Look at political figures. Policy competence matters far less than projected certainty. The candidate who radiates doubt loses to the candidate who radiates conviction, even if that conviction is based on simplified or incorrect assessments. Because voters don't want nuance, they want certainty in an uncertain world. This is the dark truth about power in modern systems. Authenticity loses to conviction. The person who honestly admits uncertainty, who accurately represents complexity, who humbly acknowledges limitations, they get bypassed by the person who simplifies everything into a confident narrative. Is this fair? No. Is it true? Yes. And once you understand this, you have a choice. You can rail against it, or you can use it strategically. The integrated approach is this: maintain your connection to reality in private. Do your research. Understand the actual odds. Acknowledge genuine constraints. But when you step into the public arena, when you're pitching, leading, influencing, you operate from unshakable conviction. You're not lying. You're emphasizing one aspect of reality, your belief in a potential outcome, over another aspect, the statistical probability against it. This is what separates leaders from followers, creators from consumers, those who shape the future from those who simply inhabit it. So let's synthesize what we've explored. Delusional self-belief works because humans don't respond to objective reality. We respond to projected certainty. We follow people who seem to know where they're going, even if their certainty is manufactured. We invest in visions that feel inevitable, even if the evidence is thin. We become what we repeatedly declare ourselves to be, even if the declaration precedes the evidence. This isn't a moral statement, it's a mechanical one. The universe rewards conviction, not accuracy, persistence, not probability, belief, not evidence. Machiavelli understood that power flows to those who seize it with certainty, not those who wait for permission. Nietzsche understood that becoming requires breaking from what is toward what could be. The Stoics understood that internal conviction shapes external reality. Modern psychology confirms all of it. The person with delusional self-belief isn't ignoring reality. They're creating a new one through the sheer force of their conviction. They're collapsing probability through action. They're bending the arc of outcomes toward their vision simply by refusing to acknowledge any other possibility. Is this dangerous? It can be. Unchecked delusion leads to recklessness. Belief without adjustment leads to catastrophic failure. But, and this is crucial, most people are in far more danger from insufficient self-belief than from excessive self-belief. Most people sabotage themselves through doubt long before reality does. They quit before they're beaten. They never try because they've already calculated failure. They live small lives not because they lack potential, but because they lack conviction. So here's the uncomfortable question you need to ask yourself. Are you failing because your beliefs are too delusional, or because they're not delusional enough? Are you being realistic, or are you using realism as armor against the terror of attempting something great and possibly failing? Because here's what I've observed. The people who change the world are almost always a little bit crazy, not clinically insane, but operating from a conviction that defies reasonable assessment, believing impossible things, acting as if certainty when everyone else sees only risk. And then, through sheer persistence, through strategic action, through the magnetic force of their conviction, they make the impossible real. The delusion becomes truth, the vision becomes structure, the belief becomes legacy. Not because they ignored reality, but because they refused to be imprisoned by it. So the final question is simple. What would you attempt if you believed with delusional certainty that you could not fail? Because that belief, that irrational, unjustifiable, impossible belief, might be the only thing standing between who you are and who you could become. The darkness isn't in the delusion, it's in the doubt. Choose wisely.